Amy Emerson, welcome to the How Humans Work podcast.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I'm excited to be here with you.
I'm really glad to have you here. It's something I've dreamt about for a while, and now it's happening, and it's good. And I'm really excited to have a conversation about psychedelics and society with you.
Yeah,
I think it's obviously kind of at everywhere we turn, at least everywhere I turn. It's part of our society in a way, and it's also not allowed in a way. So we're at this kind of crossroads of time, and you have a lot of experience in this zone. So I'm really excited to journey with you in this way and podcast. Yeah.
there's a lot to unpack with psychedelics. It is a very popular conversation, very different than when I first started down this pathway of working on psychedelic research.
Yeah. What was the conversation like, and when you started? What was going on in that time?
So I started to get interested in psychedelic research in the late 90s. And, it was just it wasn't something that was in the news, at least not usually in a positive way at that time. And it wasn't something that a lot of people were talking about. It wasn't something that I even really talked about too much with colleagues where I was working in vaccine research. And that has really changed over the years, where I think partly because of research, partly because of getting information out there, and the work specifically that we were doing at MAPS was on treating trauma. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. So as there started to be research and information that came into the media, and most of it was positive, people were telling their own stories about healing, and we were publishing research on it. And that started to shift the conversations. But I think at the time when I started in this, I'm not in academics. I worked in traditional drug development, but for people that were interested in working in academics, like the feedback they would get is, "Don't work on that; it will kill your career." And now everybody's like, "How can I work on psychedelics? How can I make a name in this?" And so it's very different.
And what are the kind of the milestones along that path that allowed it? So is it particularly the work with maps, or is there additional gate openers that, so to speak, that allowed it to move forward into what it is today?
I think there was a number of groups doing research. MAPS included USON, not it wasn't USON at the time, it was Hefter, and then academic research. And so those were kind of the early work. And then I also think the changes in cannabis and people using cannabis and speaking about that and it being used in a medicalized way, that also started to open the doors. And just as there was more, it builds on itself. Research goes out there, people's stories go out there. Storytelling is so powerful, which is why I love podcasts. Is for the storytelling aspect of it. Go out there, and then more research, and then more people getting into the field, and those things changed. And I think for MAPS, once we really hit a milestone of FDA drug development and publications on FDA-sponsored clinical trials, not just academic studies, and then as each of those kind of built on itself, it really opened the conversation more. It was like legitimacy and something that had been stigmatized for a really long time. All of a sudden, there was professional publications, not just sensationalized publications that were out there. And so people started to pay attention.
The stigma part is a conversation, right? I know we want to get into that because I think it's really important. And maybe we should just go there and talk about the process of why it's stigmatized and how we destigmatize the
Hmm.
use of psychedelics. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there was the whole just say no Nancy Reagan era that created a lot of stigma. And I don't know how far back you want to go, but I think a lot of times the stigma around this is really political, right? It was a politicized kind of viewpoint going back to cannabis and to other drugs that people used. There was a kind of a political backlash of the people that were using the drugs were also the people that might have been anti-war, and much more had a liberal agenda. And so drugs became associated with a group of people all the way back with Nixon. And so I think that's where it started, right? Because if you look prior to that, I mean, psychedelics have been used in culture for thousands and thousands of years, right? Like possibly 10,000 years ago, even we were using mind altering substances in very sacred traditions and in ceremonies, and they were part of culture. When it became more of a associated with a political viewpoint is where the stigma started, and then there was just a lot of misinformation, and I think you also kind of have to separate plant medicine from synthetic medicine and
Mm.
medicines in a lot of way too, because people will look at those two things very differently as well.
Can we give examples of that just to kind of bring people up to the difference between plant medicine and synthetic?
Yeah, plant medicine, anything that you can grow. So long histories of use with peyote, ayahuasca, psilocybin, ibogaine, cannabis. These have long, long traditions. And I think when you think about synthetic medicines, you think about things that are white powder, right? And those tend to be more stigmatized even and have harsher penalties around them for if you're caught with them. So just and right now, I think there's a big discussion of plant medicine and non-plant medicines because there's state level reforms going on. So everything has changed so much from this time of when it started the Just Say No to where everything. This is where scheduling started to happen, and there were very harsh penalties for having psychedelics or other drugs. And that has changed over the time with research and also just with a lot of activism. So this is an interesting program that I work on, I feel like, because I work in the medicalization piece of it. So working with federal medical regulatory agencies to bring this back through. So it's a prescription medicine. And that's how most things become a prescription medicine. But with psychedelics, it's a lot different because there's been a culture of, right, there's been a culture of indigenous use, and then there's recreational use, and these things are all out there prior to entering clinical trials. So it's made it a kind of a multiple lenses on how to approach bringing psychedelics back into culture. You can be looking at it from a state level reform lens, which a lot of people are doing. So changing the drug laws, which I do think are really important because I think there's a lot of very unfair drug laws out there, and I'm much more for harm reduction and education than I am for penalizing. And then there's also an indigenous use lens, and then there's like a medical lens, and I think there's work being done on all of those fronts. But I always think of this as a mission and a medicine, that it's been the changes to it have been because people have taken up the mission of bringing back psychedelics back into culture. And so it's not just a medicine in the way that we think of the drug development and things being prescribed.
It's like lots of layers going on all at once.
Always with this,
Yeah.
it's
I mean,
complicated.
there's not one psychedelic, there's not one approach to using psychedelics,
There's not one reason for using them. Yeah.
and there's not one reason for using them. Yeah. There's a lot going on. And the stigma side though, right? Because
Hmm.
I'm suddenly flashing back to my dad and like early school videos where they're like showing people high on angel dust and that they thought they
Uh-huh.
could fly, and there's the kind of fear that was around some of these mind altering substances in
Yeah.
elementary school that was kind of like the methodology at that time
Yeah.
to inoculate kids and be like, don't do this.
Yeah.
You could really something could really go bad,
Yeah.
and so and then it evolved into like in our case for our conversation today, talking about MDMA in particular, but the ecstasy conversation and the fears around ecstasy and the
Yeah.
the culture that was there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So say a little bit about that.
First, MDMA was used in therapy, really. It was rediscovered in, I think, the 80s, most famously by Sasha Shulgin, who was a chemist, UC Berkeley professor, also worked in pharma, and resynthesized MDMA, which had been first synthesized in the early 1900s, and then kind of shelved. It was synthesized because company was looking for drugs for certain diseases, and they synthesized this. It didn't seem to work for what they were thinking about. They put it on a shelf. Sasha Shulgin and some others based on the molecular shape of MDMA, had some ideas about what it could be used for and what kind of drug it could be. Somebody resynthesized it, told Sasha about it. He got very interested, also then synthesized it and tested it on himself. And this became, he realized how important this could be. And him and his wife, Ann Shulgin, started kind of testing it in a small group of people, realized it could be really important for helping people process trauma and be used in therapy. Then they started to share it with Leo Jef. There's a whole book written about him called The Secret Chief. And Leo Jef was a psychiatrist that had pretty much was going into retirement. And when this was introduced to him, he was like, this is really important. And he started training and sharing it with lots of other therapists. So very different way than most drugs enter into kind of into society, right? So this came in through that lens of helping couples and helping people process therapy. It went out to thousands and thousands of therapists. This is where our understanding of how to use MDMA for therapy came from. It wasn't a scheduled drug at that time. I don't think the scheduling even quite, I don't remember when the scheduling system came in, but MDMA wasn't scheduled. Now, you can imagine with all these people using it in a therapeutic setting, some people are like, well, this is actually quite nice and everybody should have it. And so then it kind of escaped out more into a recreational setting and into the rave scene. And that's when I think the government started to get fearful of all these people using this new substance. And it was becoming very widespread. There's a documentary on that too, the Start Club in Dallas. It's a great story about kind of how it came into the party scene. So it was emergency scheduled in the 80s, meaning that it was put in Schedule 1 that there was no medical use. And Rick Doblin, who started MAPS, knew this, like people knew this was going to happen and people were activating around it. Like that this should not happen, that it would be
So they saw it coming. They were planning before. Yeah, okay.
They saw it coming. And so Rick had created a nonprofit and actually tried to prevent the scheduling. And that's a longer story that we won't get into. People can find it online. But he also knew that if it did get scheduled, the only way that we would be able to bring it back really is to do the research on it. And there was a ton of research. There was all kinds of publications because people were using it in therapeutic settings and people were starting to study it. So it did get scheduled. And Rick had thought ahead to have MDMA made at Purdue University, enough for doing clinical trials, a lot of clinical trials, really. And there's still some of that original MDMA left. And so that was kind of it was kept in storage at Purdue University until Rick could get approval from FDA to do clinical trials in PTSD. And it took a long time. It was scheduled in I think finally scheduled in 1986. We didn't start our first clinical trial till 2003. So just so much. This is again like that stigma and this is a bad drug.
Right.
This is, there's no reason to study it. It shouldn't be brought through the FDA. But thankfully we had people in FDA that put science above politics and did agree to the first MDMA PTSD study. And it was actually, the first one was a safety study, and then we went into PTSD. And that was the foundation for our whole program. But the reason we knew how to use it and how to write those protocols was because of the history of use when Sasha and Ann gave it to Leo Jef. And it's just a very unusual story of how a drug comes into the medical system.
So people understood its value. So let's talk a little bit let's talk a little bit about the value there in the therapeutic setting, the importance of a therapeutic setting, and then maybe transition into some of the value in the post-traumatic stress situations. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe in order to understand the value in the setting is to say that what MDMA does, it's considered to be a pro-social drug. So it opens up people to talk. It also decreases fear, increases trust, increases ability for people to access memories, especially traumatic memories, in a way that feels safe. It allows people to talk with each other in a trusting way. So this is again why the therapists, when they first started using it, were like, "Oh, this could be great for couples therapy," because people can have difficult conversations in a trusting and caring way. And they can also build that trust with the therapist that's in the room with them. So this is kind of the subjective experience of MDMA. It's also the way it's working in the brain is increasing the activity in the prefrontal cortex, decreasing activity in the amygdala. So this kind of goes along with the increase in trust, decrease in fear. It's also working on the HPA axis. It's a fast reset for the HPA axis, which your neurohormones, cortisol, all of this
Hypothalamus, pituitary,
hypothalamus,
adrenal
yeah,
axis. Yeah.
something that is usually not working well in people that have trauma. They're kind of stuck in the like fight or flight. So MDMA is really important because it affects all of these systems, right? It's your subjective, your emotional, it's affecting your brain, and it's affecting this kind of HPA axis all at one time. And it lasts for anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. Our sessions that we do in the clinical trials and what most people do are about an 8-hour session. And then you use it 3 doses spaced about 1 month apart. And so that you have time to integrate what you learn during the MDMA session. So
In
that's
a therapeutic context with a therapist.
yes, yeah.
Okay.
So you're doing preparatory sessions so that people understand, especially in a clinical trial, you're doing a lot of screening to make sure it's safe for somebody to use this. You're doing informed consent. You're getting to understand their history, and then you're doing a treatment, which to me a treatment is 3 doses 1 month apart with 3 integration sessions after each one. And you're doing
And
it
that's the
with a therapist.
protocol that your organization was researching. Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Great.
So that's kind of why it works in the setting. And it can work for trauma, it can work for couples therapy, it can work in group therapy type of sessions also. Um, and it does improve depression, though we haven't done separate depression studies. Depression is a part of PTSD, so you don't know if it's just because the PTSD symptoms are also improving. And there's different ways to combine therapy with it, and there's just tons of research being done right now by lots of different people on really how to use MDMA with some type of therapy to help people.
Just to orient people,
Hmm.
we're in the powdered version of psychedelics. We're in the stuff that doesn't grow, the stuff that's made.
Yes, this
We're
is
in the
synthetic.
medical
Yeah.
model,
Yes.
and we're in the therapeutic containment
Yeah.
style approach, and we're in the research world trying to battle back against the scheduling one of MDMA
Yeah.
and try to say, hey, this has value for society, this has value for people. We know for sure with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That's
Yeah.
the evidence that came out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's just for me, as someone who's interested in stress, what I like is the vigilance, right? The threat vigilance, the danger vigilance, being able to help someone uh, tamper that down, being able to mute that aspect, because it makes a lot of sense. What happens when people go through trauma is like anybody goes through trauma.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, the vigilance system, the neuroception,
Hmm.
the sympathetic aspect, which we talked about, not you and I, but I spoke with Deb Dana about this in the polyvagal episode about that sympathetic fight or flight aspect,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. People are
Yeah.
stuck in that. And they'll describe that. And you can see it in the images of the brain as well. Like, so there's multiple things that go into that fight or flight. But your body and your mind basically think you're still in the dangerous situation.
Yeah.
You don't know that in the present space and time, you're actually safe and that event is not currently happening. And that's what MDMA allows people to do pretty rapidly.
After one session, like people make a big
After
shift.
one session, people have, it's a rapid onset of effect, is what we would call it in a clinical trial, where they're seeing improvements after one session.
I think you said that the MDA actually has other applications. Part of it is because it opens this thing called critical periods. Yeah.
Yeah. So with a critical period, the critical period is a time of where your brain is more open to learning, and we have critical periods throughout our life, and it was thought that those critical periods pretty much closed as you're hitting your 20s. But it turns out psychedelics reopen critical periods, and different psychedelics reopen them for different amounts of time, and they probably open them in some different ways. This is still like a new area of research. You can look at Doblin at UC Berkeley. She's done really incredible research on critical periods. So for MDMA, this critical period of learning is reopened for a couple of weeks. And that's why integration is so important. You might learn a lot from being in the MDMA session, but the time that you're making the changes and like you're taking it in and making meaning of what you learned is during the integration sessions. And that's happening in the weeks after that MDMA session. And that's partly also why we space the sessions a month apart, so that people have time for this integration and for taking advantage of that critical period. And because of this, not just with MDMA, but with other psychedelics, and understanding the length and what type of critical period they might be able to reopen, you can even think about using a psychedelic for somebody that's had a stroke. Strokes, actually, people's critical periods are reopened after a stroke for about 6 months. So people will make a lot of gains, maybe 6 months, for 6 months after their stroke. And then it's difficult to make more gains after that. But a psychedelic could reopen a critical period, and you could do physical therapy as part of the work with the psychedelic to help people regain like some motor skills or some speech skills.
It's amazing. I never thought about it as an application for that, but that's very cool.
Yeah.
All right, so I feel like we're in the MDMA neighborhood. We talked about all the places we could go, but we're here, and we're also close to this idea of like the legalization process, right? So the studies have been done, the anticipatory forethought that Rick Doblin with MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Sciences.
Studies.
That's it. Yeah. That work was done, and it's been in process, and you were highly involved in it. I have a lot of curiosity about that process of bringing, in this case, a therapeutic medical model of psychedelics into the social conversation, and the benefits of that, the gift of being in that conversation, also the challenges that are there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Can you say a little bit more about what you're interested in around that topic? I feel like all these topics are so big, and I feel like I could.
Yeah, that's good. So to be really specific, I'm like, okay, Amy had to encounter the FDA.
Yeah.
People talk shit about government all the time, right? And then people talk shit about psychedelics. People talk shit about this and that, right? There's all these kind of like perspectives people have. And I feel like you had this up close conversation around a real scientific matter that has mental health benefits for the society. And you had to bring that and do that work, and what that was like. Like, was that, was it fair? What was it like to encounter the FDA? What was it like to deal with the different political forces and counter forces, and just kind of like, what's that territory like?
Yeah. It is not for the faint of heart, that is for sure. Drug development is hard. It is long, whether you're working on psychedelics or not, but it makes it extra difficult, I think, when you're working on something that is stigmatized, like we've talked about, and that is scheduled. There's a lot of rules and regulations around scheduled drugs and how they can be handled, and they create a lot of barriers to research. I mean, even just the first approval of a very small, simple protocol through the FDA took years and years and years. And finding an ethical committee, the IRBs, every clinical trial has to have an IRB review it. And this is your review of ethics. Just finding one that would be willing to review it was very difficult. And then finding people to work on a clinical trial like this. Most academic institutions where a lot of clinical trials are done would not allow the people working at those academic institutions to work on a trial. So Michael Mithofer, that worked on our very first study with his wife Annie, he was at a university and he lost his position there because he was going to work on psychedelics. So people gave up a lot in order to work on this at the beginning. So that also means you don't have a lot of the structure that you're used to support doing the work that's needed to show something is safe and efficacious. So that's just like one of the first barriers. And then it takes a lot of time. We had to have somebody in the FDA who was willing to put the kind of the research over the politics. And so that changed things when that happened for us. We had somebody that kind of went to bat for us within the FDA and said, we are going to approve this clinical trial for people for this group to work on. This is, I think, also why we had to do it from a nonprofit. There's no way that this could have been done. It would have taken too long for a for-profit organization to do it. You would expect, you would have expected the for-profit to start making money, right? And so most pharma companies aren't going to have the time and the patience to work on something that takes this long to go through. Once we had kind of gotten through some of those barriers, then it was developing the relationship with FDA and raising the money to do these studies. It's very expensive to do such a long study, especially something that requires therapy as well. So these are very intensive studies to do. And then trying to explain to the FDA and provide them the right data in order to keep kind of progressing through the process of phase 2 studies into phase 3 studies. When we did get through our phase 2 program, we had developed that relationship with more institutions that were doing the clinical trials. Data was out there. People were the conversation was changing, and FDA actually gave us breakthrough therapy status, meaning that they saw this was an important research program and that it was for a life-threatening illness. So you get extra time and input from the FDA when you have something like that. So I would say, as you build on each step before, the relationship with FDA improved and changed until we got into our phase 3 program, which we were able to accomplish despite it happening during COVID, which happened right in the middle of trying to do our second phase 3. All of this has been a really long haul. And I felt like FDA had been pretty fair once we finally got going with them and developed the relationship with them. As we moved on to each protocol, I felt like it had been pretty fair. I think that there's a lot more ways that these things could be more efficient. But when we got to the end of the phase 3 program and we submitted our NDA, which is the new drug application, which is the last step in order to make something an approved medicine, there was a lot, I see it as a lot of government and societal fear coming out. These are not easy medicines to work with. They open people up and they make them vulnerable. People are vulnerable when they're doing this type of work. And without proper training and without proper oversight, as in many areas of our medical system, bad things can happen. And we did have a really horrible event happen where there was sexual abuse in a very small study in Canada. And we made that public. And I think that created a lot of fear that this would be happening to more people if this was approved. And so there was a lot of kind of pushback that came out against approving a drug like MDMA. I think that there was also then reputational fear from the FDA as well, and in an election year. And there was, doing a program over the number of years that we worked, things change and you learn a lot more, and you would have done some of those studies differently. But all of that kind of came to a head during the FDA review meeting and the open public period. And I think that at that time, I don't think it was really that we were treated fairly at that point. I don't think that the review committee that was put together had enough knowledge to do that. This is separate from the FDA. FDA puts together a review committee for this kind of public hearing. And I think that whole system needs to be reformed. And in fact, right around the time that we were going through this, there's a whole initiative going on in the government and with the FDA to reform that whole process. So I think, and now, but we should also normalize this, and that this happens in drug development all the time, that you don't get approved after your phase 3 studies and you have to go back and do more work. It felt really hard, I think, for the psychedelic ecosystem because there was so many people that had put so much time and energy into this, and so much data had been generated that was positive, and it felt like answered the questions that FDA needed in order to decide if this was safe and effective,
Mm-hmm.
and that there were ways to approve it even on a limited basis with a lot of safety parameters in place, like only on-site delivery. This is not a take-home medicine. It's only given 3 times, patient registries, like really, really handled in a careful way. But I think when some of the reputational risk during a election year came out, the least risky thing for FDA to do is to push a decision down the road. And that's what feels like happened.
Yeah.
So
So
now we're
kind
in
of
the process.
bad timing. Yeah. Yeah. What's the process now? That's great. What's
And so then you go back and you answer those questions, and that's what the group is doing now, is looking at how do we answer the questions,
yeah.
because this isn't going to stop. Like, it's gone too far down the road. There's too much potential healing that's out there for people that are really suffering. We have a crisis in our mental health system right now. We have very high suicide rates, especially in the veterans, but not just in the veterans. You know, the other kind of hidden group is women that have had sexual trauma. You know, the veterans have helped us open the door for all the discussion, because even freaking having a discussion about trauma is, stigmatized. It's like really difficult and easier for the veterans in some way. And so they really opened
Yeah.
that door, and they've opened that door for, there's more women and more civilians that have PTSD actually than there are veterans.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's that group that has brought it to the forefront, and it's not going away. The work is going to continue. So I have no doubt that the questions will get answered, and this will go back through the FDA and it will get approved. And FDA is trying to do what they're set up to do, which is to keep people safe and to make sure only effective medicines are out there. But we've
Yeah.
created a lot of
Yeah.
maybe inefficiencies while we've been doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So thank you so much for answering that question, because part of my interest in the social cohesion theme of this season is this idea that, like, how do we do a society of 330 million people? You know what I mean? Like, how do we make it work? Because it's really hard to be. We're not going to be perfectly cohesive, but how do we get cohesive enough where it's more effective? And that, so I feel like in a way you were speaking to the, like, if it could been more efficient, if the processes could have been maybe more receptive or more accelerated or less delayed, that would have actually, it benefits the people who may
Yeah,
need this medicine. The other thing I want to say here is I really appreciate you acknowledging the vulnerability and the condition of the psychedelic experience.
yeah,
And I want to come back
really
to that in a
important.
minute. I
Very
want to come back to that in a minute. But the other thing that I think that's so even important is just the conversation of trauma and naming, yes, women who survive sexual assault have more PTSD than veterans. And I have to say, because I had a good friend who grew up in the projects in the gang life, his experiences, he feels like a veteran, but nobody sees the trauma of what it meant to grow up in that reality as a young person, right?
Racial trauma
And
is
well,
really
not just, yeah, racial, but
hard, and
also
also
poverty
violence, the poverty,
and the violence that can be
yeah,
in that culture as well, or some parts of that culture, the gang
yeah,
culture. So
yeah,
all of that's there.
yeah.
And I wanted to stick a little bit longer because you were presenting the theme of trauma into this government structure.
Hmm.
Like, hey, there's trauma here,
Yeah.
right? And so from the politician side that I see, very few of them actually have a good grasp of what that means in that part of human experience. some do, some don't. So I'm kind of wondering, as you're like, hey, we're working with these vulnerable people. They've been through trauma. They're at risk for suicide. What's the kind of tonality and the response you get from that you guys got from that institution saying, hey, this matters? Did you find people receptive? Did you find people that cared? Did you find people who got it, or did you find people who really didn't?
I do think there are people in the FDA that really understood this, and that was part of the reason that we got breakthrough therapy.
Right.
Um, but they really try, I think, to stay very unemotionally involved and not put themselves kind of into. They really try to look at the documents, the paper, the data, the what did you submit. It's very focused on words on a page. Um,
Like protocol of submission or the actual effectiveness of the research?
all of it.
Okay.
It's like from dotting your I's to crossing your T's to the data. I mean, all of it, and all it is very government agency heavy.
Very formal, right?
Very
Very formal.
formal, very,
Yeah.
very formal.
Yeah.
Where we found a lot more understanding and incredible amounts of support was actually on the Hill, like at the House and Senate, and
Wow.
through our representatives. And I think partly because of the vets, right? And so as this started to happen and we were getting this pushback, there was so much support and so many letters written from
Yeah.
the senators and the representatives. Uh, Senator Bergman did an incredible letter and had a record number of signatures across both parties. This was very bipartisan. And I think the reason that we got that and the why it is so bipartisan is because trauma is, it can happen in any family, and most people have someone in their family that has suffered some type of trauma or mental illness, or they know a vet, or they know someone that's been had a violent crime or sexual assault. Unfortunately, right? It's so widespread. So this is an issue that people can personally understand. I don't feel like FDA did a lot of personally kind of taking it in. I think there were individuals in the FDA that did, but that's the process really doesn't support it. But we did, and we continue to have an incredible amount of support from the government. And a lot of government reform is happening at the state level as well.
Okay.
That can move faster than federal. And so I do think that people do get it. They get it. They see the numbers of suicides. They see the mess that are like I consider that mental health to be one of our biggest public health issues right now, and that is seen in the government. And people do want to do something about it. There's been no new tools to treat mental health disorders in like 2 decades, barely. Like it's just starting. Like I'm seeing it happening with devices, transcranial stimulations, like that's coming out. Esketamine got approved, which is really a big deal for depression. There's state level reform, so people are using plant medicines in kind of either in like group mental health support, but not necessarily through the medical system, but like through support for use in group therapy type things in Oregon. It's the first clinic just got approved in Colorado, in Denver. They passed it. There's work being done in New Mexico. Oh, there's so many states that are trying to do this. So people do get it because there's a lot of power and a lot of movement behind all of this because people do get it, and everybody knows someone that is suffering in some way with their mental health.
Well said. Can we move from the MDMA clinical trial FDA encounter into a broader conversation? Because you're talking about the broader movement now, and we're kind of out of other use cases, other situations, right? So to just give people a frame, when you talk about these state allowed local level, what are we talking about right now? We're talking about recreational freedom, or are we talking about ceremonial.
Yeah,
At
so maybe
stake
just
here?
stepping back and saying, like we said, psychedelics have been used in humanity. There's no bringing it back into society. It's been here, and I don't think it's ever going to go away. Right? So thousands and thousands of years, different contexts. Most of those were like ceremonial and sacred type of use traditions. And now reintegrating it is about looking at all the different ways that it can happen. So I've been talking about a very specific entree in, which is the medical model. But there's also ceremonial uses, very indigenous uses that are steeped in tradition. There's also retreat type models, and that's a little bit more what we're talking about in the state levels as retreat models. And then there's um, recreation. So all of these maybe being non-medical, but even saying non-medical for things
I
outside of the
know.
FDA, right? I mean, like a ceremonial use has a medical aspect for that cultural tradition, right? So
Well, I mean, just to go back to the science, when we're talking about, hypervigilant amygdala or
yeah,
a dysregulated HPA axis, too much vigilance, and it's
yeah,
like, and the vulnerability of the state and the teaching of the different plant medicines, that how could that not be a medicine, and
yes, exactly. It's a medicine for our spirit, even, right? And it may be that we don't have that groups didn't have the context to understand what they were doing, but they understood that it was a medicine, and it's called a medicine.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
right, right,
yeah. And then there's individual use for, I think individual use is important, and there's recreational use.
yeah.
Recreate.
I know, I
Recreate.
was thinking about that. I think most people think recreational use is like people are going to the club and like partying, right? And some people do
Some
use
people are doing
psychedelics in
that.
that
Dancing
context, right?
is
Yeah,
amazing.
right. But it also, in if I understand it right, recreational also means the recreation that it can be not a traditional ceremony or an indigenous lineage, but something that one does individually that's not about partying. It's about personal connection or personal exploration. Is that right?
I like to call hikadelics. I think out in nature, uh, either
Uh-huh.
with one other person or a couple of people out in nature on a
Mhm.
hike is another amazing use for certain psychedelics. So
Yeah.
all of these things though are about bringing us back to ourselves, right? It's like this internal healing, and then it's also and in order to connect with other people, we need that internal healing first. It's like there's a lot of MDMA especially is very amazing for kind of self-reflection, self-forgiveness, empathy for self, things that we try to do during maybe meta meditations, really important aspect of it. That when you're whole, you're then able to connect more wholly with other people. And I think that there's, Rick talks about the spirituality of humanity, and that really working through the medical model is one aspect for getting this out to people that need help with trauma. But there's a much broader idea here of allowing people to reconnect spiritually with themselves and others. It allows people to find like meaning, purpose, connection, maybe interrupt some multi generational trauma. And inherited traumas. Just these things are really important. I think when we've lost maybe that type of work happened more within community settings when we had closer, tight knit communities, but we're dispersed. The world is big. We're uber connected now, and we lose a lot of that. So, how do we bring it back?
So it's here, but it's also kind of stronger, more accepted, and more publicly talked about than it's ever been, right? Psychedelic
Yeah.
medicines and psychedelic practices.
Yeah.
I guess the big thing lately has been more microdosing, where people have been like, "Hey, I don't have to have a full wild experience of mind alteration or mind manifesting, right? Mind revealing." So it's I guess the etymology of psychedelics is.
Mind
Um,
manifesting. Yeah.
yeah, and I just have to, as I've been getting ready for this show, I've been like, this is really interesting because I just did uh, a podcast on cacao as a
Uh
medicine,
huh.
as a heart medicine.
Yeah.
I just did a show on polyvagal and about the nervous system, and I also did a show on psyche and eros Just to name that psyche is like the psyche is like the old Greek myth of the god. She became a goddess, but she was born a girl, and Eros fell in love with her. And there's a whole long story. You can listen to the podcast about it, or you can go read the myth itself. But that's amazing. But just the other symbol or the other meaning for psyche is butterfly, right? And
Oh,
so
wow.
inside psychedelic is also the idea of transformation.
Yes.
Is the ability to metamorphize or change states,
Yeah.
right? And I think this gets into a little bit of like the critical periods and the neuroplasticity, right? And the
Yeah. Good
availability
point.
of psychic energy. um and I'm tying this in a little bit because the individual, because I was thinking, I was on a walk yesterday. It wasn't a hikadelic, it was just a walk, just a hike with the buddy. It was a ruck. I was rucking, and was just really thinking about social cohesion and this theme of the, as I understand it, evolutionarily, humans are way better at moving from me to we than we are from us to them, right? Like we can make that jump. And there's something here around cohesion and like, why is it important to help people deeply with their vulnerabilities, their traumas, their dysregulated states?
Yeah.
Which I think are highly abundant in Western society. They're highly abundant in the techno society that we have,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's a lot of safety in a lot of ways, but there's also a lot of like um, disconnection
Yes.
that's like abounding
Totally. We
right
learned
now. And I
a lot
think
about
especially with the younger
connection.
people, like,
Yeah.
there's like this weird paradox where we're hyper connected, but somehow we're disconnected. Um, and so I guess my argument, and I'm just going to put it to you to just chew on or say anything about that. I think that the value that psychedelics may be holding in society is that deep regulation with the the vulnerable and the very human parts of ourselves that we're going through at any phase and any passage, and that they can show and teach us. That's my experience. That's my experience. Is they're allies for my own development, my own awareness about what I'm going through. And they make me a better man, a better husband, a better father, when I engage in them in a practice.
Yeah. We don't give ourselves in this uber connected type of society, and it's been going that way even before, I think, even before all of the electronic connection that we have. We don't give ourselves a lot of time and space for quiet and reflection and reconnection and to think and to feel and to be connected to ourselves. And how are we supposed to be connected to other people and in right relationship with them if we can't do it with ourselves first, right? And so there is this reconnection. Um, and I think each of the psychedelics has different ways of allowing that to happen. Some are more associated with a mystical experience. Some are more about heart opening and forgiveness. But they all force you to slow down and have some time. And if you're really getting the maximum benefit, you're also taking the time after for this integration and for this, increased plasticity, neuroplasticity with your brain, that helps you see more uh, patterns in your life and have emotional breakthroughs, and then changing things during these critical periods, right? So those as an individual, but I think doing it, then we also, just to go back to like some research, we did something that was a couples therapy. It was using cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy with partners. One partner had PTSD, and the other partner was in relationship with them and had significant trauma from being in relationship with someone with PTSD. You see that a lot. The whole family. PTSD is not an individual disease. It is something that a person has, but then their partner, their family, their community, and society experiences the effects of PTSD. So when you're healing and helping one person to heal, you're actually healing systems. And I think that's really important. And then there was something else you mentioned. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it made me think about we're also working on conflict resolution studies, and process for people to be in conversation in groups that are typically in conflict. So think Israeli Palestinian. And there's ayahuasca circles that are being done specifically around conflict resolution. And it's really incredible. MAPS is supporting some of those as well. It allows people to move through that us and them that you were talking about.
I mean, you just made such a beautiful illustration of what I was trying to say about just when someone the importance of healing that person holding the trauma and the impact that that can have on all those people around them. You know, it really is significant. Um, one of the things I'm sitting here, I'm appreciating you. I appreciate you, Amy, and all the work you've done around this. And taking on the hard, deliberate work of encountering the FDA and arguing on behalf of this medicine, MDMA, and its potential to help people, but also the lineage of people,
Yeah.
who've really like, I'm not, I'm not tuned into that. I'm not tracking that. I'm just living my life. I'm like, wow, look at this. There's a whole cadre of people who've dedicated their life, have made massive sacrifices, have taken risks in order to hold the potential and the possibility that, maybe society could be healthier or more whole, with a right use of psychedelics as part of it.
We're not inventing something new. This is like been here. It's here for us to relearn and reclaim this, knowledge of how to do what you're talking about. We didn't invent this. We lost it for a while, I think.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like you're talking about, there's a lineage. It wasn't completely lost. People have been holding this for a long time, and sometimes at great risk to themselves. I would say, um, I think most people have a lineage, whether they think about it or not. Whether it's, even if it's in science, it's who were your mentors? What is it that you're studying? How was that passed down to you? How were you inspired and held and taught during that period of growth? And we should really have that type of support for our whole lives, right? I think that mentorship, that learning, that understanding how knowledge is passed, like from person to person, from society, through society, and that we should be humble and understand that even when we might make a new discovery, it's based on the work of many, many people before us. So we're maybe reclaiming and refining, but we are not necessarily inventing. We're just putting our modern spin on something that's existed for a long time. And I think of myself as having a lineage. I think of myself as having a lineage from like the scientific perspective of what I learned in university. And then with this, I think of Sasha and Ann as being my lineage because they were such an amazing model for how MDMA came back into the world, with Sasha as this scientist and this amazing also explorer of the mind and inventor, and Anne, his wife, really understanding how to work in with people in altered states of consciousness, and to support that. And because people are vulnerable, and there's a lot of material that you need to travel through, and she really helped to catalog this, and normalize the experiences that people needed to go through. And so together it was kind of like this beautiful, this chemist and this therapist kind of relationship that
Uh-huh.
continues into the work that we do now. And I look back often. In fact, the Shulgins have a farm in Lafayette that's on Shulgin Road, and Sasha's old lab is still there, and they've both passed away now, but there's work being done to put that farm into a nonprofit and continue to have it be a space where people can come and learn, because they were incredibly open people. So like, this is my lineage, was to learn how they did it. They freely gave away their knowledge. They freely encouraged people and taught them and supported them to make sure that this was being done in a careful, curious way. And it's important that we continue that. Like, this is part of what we lose in society, is those threads, right? And so when you just brought up Lineage, it brings up a lot of emotion for me, because it's, that part is really important to me, of how they did this. And it is about, there's so much of it is about sharing what we learn. And this is like, kind of goes against our capitalist society and drug development and our for-profit, pharma companies. But those are also have a place, and it's important. It's for the rest of the, the ecosystem to also hold this. I always think of it as, when I talked a little bit about the fear that was coming up as we were going to get closer to approval, one of the things I say is, we're taking something that a lot of us consider sacred, and healing people is sacred work. Medicine should be sacred work, but we're putting something sacred with a lineage in a broken medical system, and we cannot fix that broken medical system at the same time we're putting this in. But we can have hope that when we're putting this in there and more people are experiencing healing, that there's also good being done from the inside, and maybe there is some healing of that system.
Yes. I feel that. I do. I feel that. Oh, thank you for saying that. Not only about the Shulgrins, but just the experience of, you know, taking something sacred, something meaningful, something very intimate and honest and vulnerable, and also naming the complexity of having, drug development. So, and that I like the idea that it's ecosystem and it doesn't dominate. And I feel like we're close to the conversation, and maybe there's more you want to say about Lineage, like other people you want to name. I don't know. Don't have to.
Oh, there's so much. It's like, that's the
Okay.
other whole conversation. But
Okay.
if you want to know more, look up the information about the Guild of Guides, and there's some amazing people within that I do consider my teachers, and I feel like it's really important for all of us to have teachers. I think you can look at um, meditation, Buddhism, and you really can look at, I think there's some really beautiful ways actually that we can look at how meditation has been brought into Western society, and how that lineage is passed on, and how we hold retreats, and how we teach, and how we have community within that. And I think it's a similar model for what can be happening with the way that we hold psychedelics. And that meditation's been brought into our medical system and recognized for its importance in helping people with depression and anxiety and all kinds of other things. So I feel like there's a lot of parallels there. But there are a lot of just incredible people that have held this during periods of time when it was not, they risked their safety, their freedom, in order to continue to hold this during times when it was very stigmatized. And a lot of people went to jail. A lot of people weren't able to stay safe during this, and yet they come there, they continue to do the work.
Um, Thank you for the parallel. I think it of the meditation um, parallel in Buddhism, and that's really helpful. It kind of gives a kind of like an imagery of where psychedelics could be and be held in our society in a way that feels like, oh, that's familiar. Yeah, I know that, you can go to a medical retreat and you could be doing meditation and mindfulness practice there. You could go on a retreat that's not medical, and you could be doing it there. You could be doing it privately in your own practice, and you can have your own relationship with it. And I guess I want to talk about safety and ethics, really. We're close. I feel the vision, and I want to keep nourishing the sense of the vision of what's possible and where it could be. But I also think it's kind of responsible to also talk about this idea of, safety. You recently told me you were at a safety summit. I'm like, oh, safety summit around psychedelics. Wow, people are thinking about this.
Yeah.
People need to know that, and also just generally for people just to talk about safety with psychedelics. I think it's useful in a conversation like this.
It's the most important part of harm reduction, is create safety, and that's, you got to talk about it. And it's yeah. So there was a psychedelic safety summit recently, And again, so interesting. Like, I come from like the scientific medical perspective, but obviously from a personal perspective and from a lineage and from all of this too. And I feel like the ecosystem really is getting the complexity of this, that we can't look at this from just one angle, that we have to look at it as a whole. So we have to look at these different use cases, medical and kind of bunching a bunch of them together and saying non-medical. And we can't, these are not separate conversations. And these things are not going to just stay in one system. So we have to talk about it with a complete picture, and of how are we going to take responsibility and accountability for the things that we're bringing into society, bringing into society, without the structures that used to hold them, right? In a traditional use, there was rules for how you held these things safely, and everybody probably knew them, and it was in a smaller group you were able to hold that. So the world is a very different place now, and we have to take responsibility for what we're doing and bringing them back in. So there's some obvious ways that we hold things, we make things safe. We try to, through a medical system and through licensing, and who gets to touch these and how are they handled and how is it used. But this isn't going to stay just in a medical system. As we said, there's recreation, there's ceremonial uses. So how do we, as a whole group, put our eyes on all of that and create systems of safety? So whether it's making sure that people feel comfortable reporting if something difficult happens and it's a non-medical use and they're not going to get into trouble or put in jail for that. What does that look like? Can we create databases that work across these different use cases so that we can really have a good picture of what's happening? How do we train facilitators? Really important, right? Especially when people are in vulnerable situations. This is, the facilitators, the therapists, the practitioners, the doctors, the nurses, all need training on this. And when serious adverse experiences happen, when somebody has a mental break during something, how do you handle it? How do you not become afraid that you're going to get into trouble as a facilitator for what's happening? How do you not overstep boundaries? Like all of this, it's a massive conversation on safety, and we have a huge responsibility. If we're
Okay.
going to bring these things back, we have to have that conversation. More important than the efficacy is the safety. How do we keep people safe during this? And it's impossible to keep everybody safe. So when something is going to happen, how do we make sure we know about it? It's discussed. The people it happened to are supported. Families are supported.
Are there any structures there for that yet, or is that just kind of like talking about it?
There are structures, right? But they're kind of each separated into these different kind of use cases, right? So it's like there's one for how you report if something happens at a doctor's office, right? But how do you report if something happens at a retreat center? Well, then are the people that were working at the retreat center licensed? Is it in the US or not in the US? So there are different structures for each one of those things, right? But we're trying to look at them a little bit more holistically, so that all of us working in this have better oversight and knowledge across what is going on. And we can figure out more systems. There's not enough, actually, I don't think, already existing. And we have, and in order to have oversight, you have to have like somebody working on psychedelics and being a facilitator that's licensed and is a licensed mental health practitioner. Well, then there's a system that exists right there that can help to regulate if that person does something wrong, they can have their license taken away.
Yeah, if they're unethical. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If they're unethical, if whatever, and if they're operating in a licensed way, they're probably going to also feel more comfortable making sure that the person that they're treating gets medical attention. Something is done. There's legal systems if somebody is abused, right? But if you're working in another country at a retreat or even one-on-one, and the people working on it have no training, aren't licensed, there's not much to help with that. Like then it ends up falling in the legal framework. So more needs to be done. There are definitely systems that exist, but how do we tie it together? How do we make it more cohesive?
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. I think it's really important, and I don't know how that's going to happen. Sounds like you don't either, but you're going to be a
But
part of the conversation.
education and open conversations is a huge part of how you start that, right? You
Right.
feel comfortable to report if anything happened to them, whether it's an ethical violation or it's a safety event that's more physical, or mental. People first need to understand that's okay. They need to be able to have access to information for what they're going to do, make good decisions about it, and feel like they have some kind of recourse if something does happen to them. So we have to kind of attack this from multiple angles, including the education one.
Hmm. That's good. I think that's good. But I did feel like a minute ago we were starting to really look at the kind of the vision and the relationship of the lineage and the
Mhm.
possibility of trauma. And I was crying actually. I don't know if you noticed, I was crying earlier in the show. But I was thinking about when you were talking about the all the people dealing with PTSD, and I have a friend who passed recently who was a Vietnam vet and worked in PTSD, and I'm reading his book of short stories. In fact, I've been editing it with some friends, kind of a posthumous, no, was it posthumously published short story, humorously too. He was funny as fuck. Mac, he was on the show. I had him. There's shows with Mac. He interviewed me once. He was fantastic, but he passed away last September, and it was amazing to read his stories and about before Vietnam, in Vietnam, when he was a teacher and not a warrior in Vietnam, but started relating with a local community, and then his integration is after coming back home, or lack of integration. And it was like there's this passage in the book. He After he comes back from Vietnam, he meets North Vietnamese soldiers, and he's helping them translate their diaries. And they're talking about these people who come to their country, and what their families must be thinking, and what's going on with their lineages, right? And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, these people are not communists. These are just people, and and so, Mac and all this whole generation was sent into Vietnam, on some ideological basis, and they had to fight people who were told they're enemy, yada yada, and they carried that. They carried those pains, the things that they had to do, and just incredibly hard, ugly suffering.
And then when they came back, they were also like, then they were stigmatized.
Holy. Some of them for sure were, absolutely.
Mhm.
And he said it kind of in his dedications, like many people didn't, they it shortened lives because of it, not just surviving the war. I mean, in the war, shortened lives, but after the war too. And it's like I had a point. I had a point about this. I'm so deep in my feelings around Mac and his loss and the story, but it's this sense of ideology. And that was the teaching for is the teaching for me in his book. It's like when we have ideologies and we don't really know what it is, we actually don't do a good job with it. And it gets back to this idea that, like, we have to kind of somehow in our social cohesion find a way to get past like strict ideologies that don't actually help us relate with other people. And I think this is kind of a long-winded emotional rant way of talking about.
No, it's such a good point. This stuff is really complex. And when we try to fit things neatly into boxes of ideology or, this, even like when we've been talking about this whole thing of like, well, this is medical and this is recreation and this is, a religious context. It just doesn't work that way. And we end up making big mistakes, I think, when we do that, when we try to like separate and put things in a box or, um, we're talking about something that opens people up to connect emotionally, physically, with themselves, with others, um, and that storytelling around it sometimes I think is the only way to like actually get to the complexity of it, is to hear people's stories,
Yeah.
about how it just doesn't fit into like one box for them.
So, where to now? Moving forward, how can people be engaged in the movement to supporting psychedelics? How can they find maybe trusted resources if they're interested in
Mhm.
exploring psychedelics?
Okay, so if you want scientific research, just it's easy to search PubMed. There are tens of thousands of publications, scientific publications in PubMed. And then there's Arrowid if you want trip reports. Arrowid is amazing. Earth and
How do you
Fire
spell that?
Arrowid. EROWID, Arrowid. Incredible resource of information for people that just want to look up any drug or trip experience that you've heard about. Another group of people that really need support, I consider what they do harm reduction and education and safety as well. Look at what's happening at the state regulation level. A new state level work that is being done that we haven't even touched on yet that I find really important and I'm trying to support myself is there's a psychedelic called ibogaine. It's the longest acting psychedelic that we know about, and it's from the Bwiti culture in Africa. It was used ceremonial as initiations, but in the 50s, I think it was discovered that it also takes away all opiate cravings when somebody's trying to get off of an opiate. And right now there's an amazing man and Brian Hubbard and his wife Jo Alice they're from Kentucky. They tried to do this Kentucky Ibogaine initiative to get the opiate abatement money to be used to support Ibogaine research in opiate addiction. And it didn't go through, but now they're working in Texas. And again, super bipartisan work here. Past Governor Rick Perry and Brian Hubbard are doing an incredible amount of work to support psychedelics there and try to get Ibogaine through for more efficient research for opiate addiction. It also has potential for TBI and PTSD, all kinds of other things. So that's something interesting that people could look at. That's like hot and current right now. And then if you know someone, help listen to their story and help promote stories, I think, of people's experience with this and help make sure that we point people to good resources to educate them before they make a decision to do this. And if you're going to go and have an experience, please make sure you do the work ahead of time to know who you're doing it with or know what you're taking and know the risks and know if you're a good candidate for it and just find the right people to work with. It's just really important. You're putting yourself into a vulnerable position that you want to have supported in a way that creates the most healing for you and minimizes harm.
Well, at the risk of cutting too early, because I know we can keep talking. I know how you and I connect. We like talking. It's good. It's been so great, Amy Emerson, to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for just a broad conversation at so many levels, but most especially touching the heart of what psychedelics can offer to people's lives and what they might be able to do for our society. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for giving me a place to have such fun conversation. You can tell I love talking about this subject. So we can always have a follow up if you have
Yes,
more
you're always
ideas.
welcome back. Definitely. Absolutely.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.